My name is Selina Bonney, and I'm an Indian Irish disabled woman. I'm a wheelchair user, but I'm much more than that. I'm also a mother and an activist and a particularly reproductive rights campaigner. I use my personal lived experience to inform my work in that area. But as a day job, I'm a public sector employee. I'm an equality and access officer for a local authority because I believe very strongly in campaigning, but I also believe at some stage you need to become the change maker. So that's kind of part of my personal philosophy. And that's about. I'm also a very passionate home cook, and it's certainly kept me sane in the last 18 months, I must say. Well, I've been an activist in the disabled people's movement for, maybe 25, 30 years now at this stage, both nationally and internationally. Originally, it was more around disability equality and independent living and teaching people how to campaign and lobby and write press releases and all that sort of thing, because I came from a music industry background initially before I went into the disabled people's movement. So I was able to use a lot of that experience, particularly within the campaigning and PR. But through my life experience and the fact that it took my husband, who's non-disabled, and myself, who is disabled, 15 years to have a child, because I would have a condition that's very common to women, totally unconnected to my disability. And it meant that I needed help to get pregnant. But because of me being a disabled person, the prejudice and exclusion and negativity that we faced within the assisted human reproduction services within Ireland was just horrific. Thankfully, 4 pregnancies, we finally had our daughter, and she's a wonderful and very challenging 13-year-old now, I must say. But I've always felt that, I was a very stubborn, very strong-willed person. And so we fought back. We kind of said, well, no, you are not the experts. And we were able to achieve our goal. But I often thought of many disabled women in particular, because the prejudice is particularly against disabled women because of the traditional notion of the woman as the carer and the mother. So I wanted to use my experience to help other disabled women, because I felt I'm strong, but maybe others aren't. Because it's very difficult when you're speaking out for personal rights, because you're opening up your core self to scrutiny. And whereas I don't mind doing that, I know there are others who do. So through that, I've become very active in the reproductive justice area, both from the point of view within the disabled people's movement. So I'm published and I lecture in relation to disability and sexuality. But also these days, I sit on the Assisted Human Reproduction Coalition on behalf of Independent Living Movement Ireland. And I'm also a regional ambassador for the Centre for Disability Law and Justice in Galway for their reproductive justice research project. And I'm a huge supporter of that project, because I can really see the potential for change from what they're going to produce in the toolkit. So it's wonderful to be part of that. It took my husband and I 15 years to have a child, because I have polycystic ovaries. And when you have a condition like that is very common to women, or any condition that's common within the population, if you are a disabled person, it makes the whole treatment and management of that condition much more difficult, because it's like when you're pregnant, everything is attributed, that's because you're pregnant. So trying to get people to separate out, the disability and the impairment from the medical condition can make things very, very difficult. So as a disabled woman, when we were trying to have a child, we went down many routes with many different hospitals and service providers. But the common thread really was one, because I didn't acquire my impairment, I didn't have an accident or an infection or anything. I was born as a disabled person. There was a core worry within the medical professionals. But what if you have a disabled child? what have you passed your condition on? And as we were saying, well, for a start, my condition's not hereditary. I'm the only disabled person in my family. And secondly, so what? It's not, to be a disabled person, you're just a person. You just have to kind of do things a bit differently. But we weren't concerned about having a disabled child, but they were. So that really caused a lot of barriers. And then, of course, the practical barriers of inaccessible examination benches and kind of the hospital that we were dealing with, because I had, as my daughter was my fourth pregnancy, I had 2 miscarriages, and then I had one little girl who only lived for an hour. So we would have had a lot of dealings with like the early pregnancy assessment unit. And in the particular hospital that we had to deal with, there was like 5 steps down into the unit. So there was those sort of practical barriers that we had to overcome. Thankfully, I was a bit more agile than I am now. And my husband is non-disabled, and he was able to kind of push me different places, noise me different places, because they didn't offer us the likes of a hoist or anything like that. And when I did actually go in as an emergency to have my daughter, they couldn't find the hoist. And then when they did, it wasn't charged up. They didn't know where the spare battery was. And, it was very practical. And then the fact that I have a medical condition, I have a respiratory condition. And you see this a lot with gynae, is that, they're trained to deal with gynae or obstetrics, but then they're not trained to deal with the other conditions and how they interact. So that caused a bit of a difficulty as well, getting that kind of a multidisciplinary team. So they were the kind of issues that and really, just even down to, I remember reading an article once, an interview with a disabled woman who had a child, and she was saying how people, the way normally if you see someone with a baby and you'll congratulate them and you'll say, I hope they turn out like you. And she was saying, as a disabled woman, an obviously disabled woman and obviously pregnant, how she didn't have that positive experience. People were afraid to say, and they didn't know what to say, So there have been a lot of different issues to deal with, and even down to knowing what equipment to buy. Like, there's no equipment in the shops that is marketed as being accessible, and it was very difficult to find the answers to those questions. But how will I get my child in and out of a cot? Which pram should I buy? And even quite often you'll find that the baby changing facility is located within the accessible toilet. But from my experience, the baby changing facility is never accessible. So when my daughter was little, I could never change her nappy when we were out in public. And even we could only go to 4 places, because only 4 places had an accessible toilet big enough that I could bring the pram in as well, so that I wouldn't be leaving my child out on her own in a pram outside a door. So these are the kind of issues that we faced leading up to the pregnancy, during the pregnancy, and then immediately after. I have, for example, when I was having my daughter, I would have known very few other disabled parents here in Ireland, whereas that's quite different now. So obviously things are improving because people are feeling more inclined to consider parenthood. So that is a positive thing. That's very, there have been some advances from a physical access point of view, in relation to kind of accessible bathrooms within kind of hospital, kind of semi-private wards and things like that, and allows to have space to have your personal assistant or someone with you and things like that. So there are some improvements, but there's still a lot to be done. Like you would still have, especially in GP surgeries, inaccessible examination couches, significant barriers to access in relation to breast check services and cervical check services. That's a big worry, big worry at the moment, in particular. But and I think medical professionals are becoming a bit more open to the fact that disabled people are people and have intersectional issues, have similar desires and dreams as non-disabled people, and they're becoming a bit more open to that. So there are definitely advances. And of course, the likes of UNCRPD and the equality legislation and the Disability Act, things like that, and the Irish Sign Language Act, they've all helped. But at the end of the day, they are only tools, and more people need to be using those tools to get their rights enacted. But it certainly has helped. I had a few different ideas for you, but sure. In the short term, services need to really ask themselves, is my service accessible? Do we have a hoist? Do we have a height adjustable changing bench? Is our accessible toilet used as the storage closet for the cleaning equipment? Do I know how to hire an Irish Sign Language interpreter? These, do I have easy read information? Because it's not just about providing information in alternative formats. You need to actually provide useful content within those formats that is actually relevant to the lives of disabled people. So they would be very short term, there's a lot that can be done without very much money. It's more about having the will and the knowledge to actually do it, and it'd be a little bit kind of lateral thinking focused and solution focused rather than problem focused. So in the short term, there are very basic things, but at the end of the day, really, the best and the most immediate thing that medical professionals can do and service providers is to ask their disabled client, their disabled patient, how can we support you? And then believe them when they tell you, because they actually are we are the experts in our own bodies and our own needs. And also to remember that just because you provided access for one wheelchair user or one blind person does not mean that you're now skilled and equipped to provide it for all of them, because each individual person will have their own way of accessing the world and their own needs for accessing the world. So it's important to remember that. But I think I suppose four to three things I would like to highlight today. One is in relation to cervical check services and breast check services. Seriously, urgently needs to be addressed, because the amount of disabled people that are going without these essential health checks, because due to the inaccessibility of the services, you would be horrified. But the problem as well is I cannot give you figures because the data is not disaggregated by disability or other kind of ground. So I can only give you anecdotal evidence through my knowledge within the disabled people's movement and with consulting with other disabled women. But that it's the tribunal of tomorrow. It's the next big tribunal, really, if we don't address, we are leaving a lot of disabled, particularly disabled women, but disabled people, just to go without these essential checks because of small issues around access that could be addressed. The other thing is in relation to assisted human reproduction. There is legislation being developed at the moment that I'm on the IHREC Coalition, and I'm there specifically because there was no voice of disabled people at all anywhere within the pre-legislative scrutiny that took place on the bill. So Independent Living Movement Ireland, and I represent them, which is a disabled persons organisation, and that means that we are of and for disabled people. So we have the lived experience to bring to the table to that legislation that's being developed. And then just more generally, innovation. There needs to be much more innovative thinking within the medical profession in relation to meeting people's needs. And I'll give you a very practical current example from my life. I have psoriasis, really bad skin condition throughout my body. Because of my other medical conditions, I can't take any medication that would affect my immunity. So I've had to use just creams for years, because the only other option would be light therapy. But in Ireland, you have to stand up to get the light therapy. And yet we can send a rover to Mars, and I'm not the only wheelchair user who has needed light therapy in the world. But there's a lack of a desire, or perhaps most professionals don't have the time, to actually look for accessible alternatives or to innovate accessible alternatives. So perhaps medical students, when they're doing their thesis and dissertations, some of them should start looking at these kind of issues and be the people to innovate the solutions. And it's through not having these ideas posed to them, not sparking the questions in their minds, because not everybody would have a disabled person somewhere within their life. Also, the other thing, again, in relation to science and innovation and medical and disability, is there needs to be some studies done in relation to how different disabilities interact with different illnesses. And where we can, like, for example, in relation to gynae health and dermatology, and how, as a disabled woman, when you're sitting in a wheelchair, how that affects your gynae health in relation to your pelvic area and the skin health. These sort of interactions, it would be really good if people could actually put some time into looking into them and acknowledging them. But to remember, and then finally, just to also remember that there needs to be time and effort put into developing ways to support disabled people to live with conditions. There's a lot of fundraising and focus on either preventing or curing, but we need to start looking at actually supporting people to live. For example, one of my other conditions is I've got pulmonary hypertension. So I had to give up flying because it's not safe. And then you've got the likes of, Branson and Musk putting billions into exploring space travel. And I've tweeted them many times and say, just take a little bit of that money and innovate a safe way for people with pulmonary hypertension to fly. Because just because we can't fly anymore doesn't mean we don't still want to explore the world and live with our condition with quality and dignity. So these are the kind of ideas I have at the moment. I often say, and even down to one thing I'm kind of harping on at with government at the moment is in relation to funding and funding equality actions. As in, you need to equality proof the equality action. Because, for example, I would have been involved through my day job with setting up an LGBTQ county network. And then I kind of, when they had done that, I said to them, okay, well, you haven't equality proofed this. So you need to look at where are the disabled LGBTQ, where are the deaf LGBTQ within the network. So help them kind of make those links. So I often say there's 2 steps to equality proofing. Because you got to do the equality action, then you got to equality proof the action to make sure that you're representative.